The choices you made in the last 5 days are already producing results. You may not be able to see them yet. Some of them won't be visible for another week, another 2 weeks, another month. But the mechanism is already running. The seeds planted in the first days of a new cycle don't wait for permission to begin growing. They begin immediately, in the dark, below the surface, before there is anything visible to confirm that something is happening. And what is growing right now in the new cycle that began on March 19th and was given its full initiating force on March 20th is being shaped, specifically and directly, by everything you have done and not done in the days since. This is not a comfortable message. It is an important one, because March 25th sits at a specific point in the new cycle's early arc, close enough to the beginning that the trajectory is still being set, but far enough in that the consequences of the first days are beginning to take their initial shape. The person who acted in the window when the window was widest is already experiencing the first returns of that action. The conversation is moving somewhere. The decision is producing the first evidence of its consequences. The beginning has its first momentum. And the person who hesitated, who deferred, who let the window pass while waiting for more certainty, they are already beginning to feel, perhaps still subtly, the particular texture of an opportunity that didn't quite materialize, of a situation that is still waiting for the engagement it needed and didn't receive. The new cycle doesn't pause while you decide how to use it. It moves. It generates. It produces the first consequences of the first choices at exactly the pace you would expect a cycle governed by Aries energy and Mercury direct to move, which is to say quickly. More quickly than you might anticipate if you've been calibrated to the slow, backward-pulling pace of the retrograde. What you do today still matters enormously, but it matters in a different way than what could have been done 5 days ago, and understanding that difference is what makes today's particular action possible and necessary. The Pisces new moon that arrived on March 19th set something in motion that is worth understanding clearly, because the shape of what it set in motion is still very much present and active on March 25th. A new moon is not a single moment that passes. It is the initiation of a cycle. The energy it carries at its beginning radiates forward across the entire 4-week arc, present most strongly in the first days, and then distributing itself as the cycle unfolds. 6 days into the cycle, the Pisces new moon's reset energy is still very much operative. The emotional and intuitive foundation it laid is still the foundation of whatever is being built, which means that the particular quality of honesty and depth that the Pisces new moon was asking for, the willingness to begin the new cycle from a genuinely honest place rather than from managed surface, is still available today, still in operation, still asking the question it has been asking since March 19th. Are you moving from the real version of yourself, or from the version you perform for everyone, including yourself? That question is not rhetorical. It has specific practical implications for the choices available to you today. Because the consequences that are beginning to appear in the first days of a new cycle are most fundamentally the consequences of that question's answer. The actions taken from the honest place produce early returns that feel like alignment, situations that open in the direction you were moving, responses from others that confirm the rightness of the direction, opportunities that surface as if they were waiting for exactly this kind of honest initiation. And the actions taken from the unexamined place, from the old patterns and habits that the retrograde was working to surface, but that resumed without being changed, those produce early returns that feel like repetition, like a familiar dynamic showing up in new clothing, like the same conversation happening in a new context, like the sense that the new beginning isn't as new as the energy suggested it would be. The consequences appearing today are telling you something. They are the early feedback of the new cycle, arriving in the particular form that this specific beginning was always going to produce given the choices made at its start. And the important thing about feedback this early in a cycle is that it is still early enough to change what the feedback is responding to. The cycle is 6 days old. The trajectory established by the first days is real, but not yet fixed. The course correction available today, if the early feedback is suggesting correction is needed, is still made on relatively easy terms. Here is the specific experience that tends to arrive around this point in a new cycle. 6 days in, with the major initiating events behind you and the first consequences beginning to show their early shape. The experience of beginning to see which of the things you set in motion are moving with the current and which are meeting resistance. The ones moving with the current have a quality of ease to them that stands out precisely because the retrograde period made everything feel effortful. A conversation is advancing in a way that feels natural and reciprocal rather than forced. A decision is revealing its logic as the consequences of it arrive. The early results are affirming the reasoning that made the decision feel right. A new direction is encountering the first evidence that it is actually the right direction, something small but specific that confirms the instinct rather than complicating it. These are the actions of the first days, already producing their early fruit. And the right response to them is to keep going, to trust the momentum they're showing you, to build on the first evidence rather than second-guessing the direction just because the beginning is still fragile. But there are also, for most people, things set in motion in the first days of the cycle that are encountering early resistance. Not the productive kind of resistance that shows you the thing is worth fighting for, the kind that shows you the thing was initiated from the wrong place. The conversation that the other person isn't responding to with the engagement you hoped for, not because the conversation is wrong, but because the way you entered it was still governed by the old dynamic the retrograde was trying to help you leave behind. The decision that seemed obvious in the first day of Mercury direct, but that is already producing a slight wrongness feeling as its early consequences arrive. Not wrong in a catastrophic way, but wrong in the quiet way that decisions made from incomplete honesty always eventually reveal themselves. The beginning that felt exciting in the energy of the new year, but that is already 6 days in, losing momentum. Not because beginnings don't have momentum, but because this particular beginning was initiated from the surface rather than from the depth of the honest self-knowledge the retrograde was building. The resistance is feedback, and feedback 6 days into a new cycle is among the most valuable information available, because it arrives early enough to be genuinely useful, rather than simply confirming what went wrong too late to correct it. The practical question for today is one that requires a brief and honest inventory. Not a lengthy self-examination, just a clear-eyed look at the first 6 days of the new cycle and what they have produced so far. What actions did you take? What were the early responses? What is moving with ease and what is meeting resistance? What feels alive and generative, and what feels like more of the same? What are the first consequences telling you about the quality and direction of the beginnings you made? This inventory is not about judgment. It is about calibration. You are 6 days into a new cycle with a long arc ahead of you, and the calibration available today is the kind that saves you weeks of moving in a direction that the early feedback was already trying to redirect. The person who takes the inventory today, honestly and without the softening of self-justification, and then adjusts their course based on what it reveals, that person will move through the rest of this cycle with a clarity and a momentum that the person who skips the inventory won't have access to. Here is what the inventory specifically looks for. In the conversations you've initiated since March 19th, which ones are moving and which are stalling? In the decisions you've made, which are producing the feeling of rightness that good decisions carry, and which are producing the subtle discomfort of a decision made from incomplete honesty. In the actions you've taken toward new directions, which are encountering the kind of receptive environment that suggests the direction is right, and which are encountering a resistance that is worth examining more closely. And in the things you haven't done, the actions you deferred, the conversations you avoided, the decisions you kept circling without landing, what are those deferrals beginning to cost you? Is there an opportunity that is showing early signs of closing because it didn't receive a response in the window when it was most open? The inventory takes 10 minutes. It requires only honest attention. And what it produces is a specific, actionable picture of where the cycle is going given the choices of its first days, and where a course correction, if needed, can still be made at minimum cost. The twist in this story, the thing that changes how you understand the urgency of what I've been describing, is that the consequences arriving today are not yet fixed outcomes. They are early signals, preliminary feedback, the first returns of the first seeds, showing their initial direction, but not yet their final form. The gardener who checks the first growth after planting doesn't despair when some seeds are showing less vigor than expected. They adjust. They water more carefully in one area. They clear the obstruction that's blocking the light from another. They do the responsive work that early growth always requires from the person who planted it. And the garden that results from that responsive attentiveness is fundamentally different from the garden that results from planting the seeds and walking away, returning only when the full consequences have arrived in undeniable form. You are the gardener of this cycle. The seeds are in. The early growth is appearing. And the most important work available to you today is not the planting of more seeds. It is the attentive, honest, responsive work of the gardener who is present to what has already been planted and willing to do what the early growth is indicating needs to be done. In practice, this looks like the conversation where the early response showed you that the first approach needed adjustment, and you make the adjustment rather than doubling down on the original approach. It looks like the decision where the first consequences are producing a quieter wrongness feeling, and you sit honestly with that feeling rather than suppressing it with the rationalization that you already decided and should stay the course. It looks like the opportunity that was available in the window and received only hesitation. And you reach out now, not because the window is still at its widest, but because the window is still open and the cost of not reaching out is beginning to become visible. The early consequences are guidance. Treat them as such. The cycle is still young enough to be genuinely responsive to the guidance its own early signals are providing. There is something specifically available on March 25th that makes today distinct from the days that immediately preceded it, and it is the clearest and most practically useful thing about this specific point in the cycle's arc. The first days of a new cycle, the days right after the new moon and the major initiating events, carry a quality of forward-moving energy that can paradoxically make honest assessment difficult. The momentum itself, the relief of the retrograde being over, the excitement of the new Aries energy, the sense of things finally moving, all of that can sweep you along in a direction that feels right because it is moving rather than because the direction has been carefully examined. The early momentum is real, but it can carry you past the honest assessment of whether the momentum is taking you somewhere you actually want to go. By March 25th, 6 days in, the initial rush of momentum has settled enough that the honest assessment becomes possible without the momentum overriding it. You have had enough days of experience in the new cycle to see what it is actually producing. The early returns are in. The initial responses have arrived. The first evidence of where the decisions and actions of the opening days are leading is present and visible. And the Aries energy, rather than simply pushing forward, is now supporting the kind of direct, honest, clear-eyed assessment that Aries energy is actually very good at, when it's not running too fast to see. This is the specific gift of today. The momentum has settled enough for honest seeing. And the honest seeing is still early enough to be immediately actionable rather than merely retrospective. The combination of those two things, settled enough to see clearly, early enough for the seeing to produce useful change, is what makes March 25th worth paying specific attention to. The practical action for today follows directly from everything described above, and it involves a specific kind of honesty about a specific aspect of your life that the new cycle has already touched. Look at the one area of your life where the early consequences of the new cycle's beginning are most clearly showing you something. The situation where the feedback of the first 6 days is pointing most directly, either toward affirmation that the direction is right, or toward the need for adjustment. The conversation, the relationship, the work situation, the personal initiative, the direction you began moving in when the new year arrived. The one where what has happened so far is carrying the most specific and actionable information. Now look at what that information is actually telling you. Not what you want it to be telling you, not what would be most convenient for it to be saying. What is it actually saying? What does the early evidence of these first days show about whether the direction is right and the foundation is solid, or whether something needs to be adjusted before the trajectory is too established to correct without significant effort? And then, this is the action. Do what the honest seeing requires. If it requires continuing, continue with more confidence and commitment than you've been bringing. If it requires adjusting, make the adjustment today rather than deferring it into the next week when it becomes harder. If it requires a conversation that the early evidence is showing is needed, have that conversation today while the cycle is still young enough to be genuinely reshaped by its outcome. If it requires acknowledging a mistake made in the first days and redirecting, make the redirect cleanly rather than compounding the original mistake by continuing in a direction the early evidence is already showing was wrong. The honest action today, taken in direct response to the early consequences the cycle is already producing, is the most powerful action available right now. More powerful than the action available in the first days was, in a specific sense, because the first days had initiating force but not yet feedback. Today is both. The initiating force is still present, and the feedback is now in. Acting on both simultaneously, carrying the initiating force of the new year forward, while genuinely responding to the honest feedback of the first days, is the specific skill that determines whether a new cycle becomes genuinely new or simply a new phase of an old pattern. The next few days will continue to generate the early consequences of the choices being made in this window. By the end of this week, the trajectory of the first 2 weeks of the cycle will be reasonably established. By the middle of next week, the seeds planted in the opening days will be producing growth that is visible to more than just the most attentive observer. And by the time the cycle reaches its midpoint at the full moon, the quality and direction of everything initiated in these first days will be clearly legible. Which means that March 25th, 6 days in, with the early consequences just arriving and the trajectory still adjustable, is one of the last days in which the cost of adjustment is low. After today, the trajectory begins to calcify into pattern. After this week, the choices become harder to change without significant disruption. After next week, you are correcting a course that has been running for 2 weeks rather than redirecting one that has been running for 6 days. Today, course correction is cheap. Today, adjustment is simple. Today, the honest seeing that the cycle's early feedback is making possible can be acted on immediately and directly, and with the full force of the Aries energy that is still carrying the new year forward. And the action taken today, honest, calibrated, responsive to what the first days have actually produced, is the action that allows the rest of the cycle to build on a foundation that has been tested and found solid, adjusted where it needed adjustment, and confirmed where it deserved confidence. You came here today, which means some part of you already knew that today wasn't just another day in the new year, that the early returns of the new cycle's beginning were arriving and deserved attention, that the momentum of the opening days was producing something that warranted a clear-eyed, honest look. That instinct was right. The consequences are here, quietly but unmistakably, in the first evidence of the directions you moved in and the conversations you initiated and the decisions you made when the window was at its widest. And they are telling you something specific about where the cycle is going given the choices of its opening days. Listen to what they are telling you. Not with anxiety, not with self-judgment, but with the honest attentiveness of someone who understands that the cycle is young and the trajectory is still shapeable, and the feedback of the first days is among the most valuable information you will receive in the entire arc of what this new year will become. The consequences are in. The feedback is real. The adjustment, if adjustment is needed, is still easy. And the action that today is asking for, Whatever that action specifically is in the particular terrain of your actual life is available to you right now, in this day, with the full force of the new year and the honest clarity of the early returns both pointing in the same direction. Move consciously into what the next days are already beginning to build. While the building is still early, while the shaping is still possible, while the foundation is still fresh enough to be adjusted before it sets into the pattern the rest of the cycle will stand on. This is the day for that. This is the moment.